Tell you who wrote my reading this morning. It comes from an anonymous source. It's called Spiritual Fitness. It's a very simple reading. If you can start the day without caffeine or pep pills, if you can be cheerful, ignoring aches and pains, if you can resist complaining and boring people with your troubles, if you can understand it when loved ones are too busy to give you time, if you can overlook it when people take things out on you when through no fault of your own something goes wrong, if you can take criticism and blame without resentment, if you can face the world without lies and deceit, if you can conquer tension without medical help, if you can relax without liquor, if you can sleep without the aid of drugs, then you are probably a dog. Here ends the morning reading. Golfing with monkeys. Now there's a sermon title that tells you absolutely nothing about where I'm going this morning unless you know the story. Does anyone know the story? Good. That's the way well, you do because I sent you the sermon. But I basically like clueless congregations because they're much more receptive than really bright ones. So here's the story. The Reverend Gregory Knox Jones, a Presbyterian minister who serves a church in Northern Virginia, tells the story. Once the English had colonized India and established their businesses there, they yearned for recreation and decided to build a golf course in Calcutta. Golf in Calcutta, however, would present a unique obstacle. Monkeys from a nearby habitat would drop out of the trees, scurry across the course, and seize the golf balls. The monkeys would play with these balls, tossing them here and there. Now at first the golfers, Reverend Knox says, tried to control the monkeys. Their first strategy was to build high fences around the fairways and greens. This approach, which initially had a bit of promise, was abandoned when the golfers discovered that no fence is really a challenge for an ambitious monkey. Next, the golfers tried luring the monkeys away from the course, but the monkeys found nothing as amusing as watching these humans go crazy when they play with their little white balls. In desperation, the British began trapping and relocating the monkeys. But for every monkey they carted off, another would suddenly appear. Finally, the golfers gave into reality and established a rather novel ground rule for that course. Golfers in Calcutta were obliged to play the ball wherever the monkey dropped it. And then Reverend Knox concludes, as you can imagine, playing under this rule could be maddening. I mean, a beautiful drive down the center of the fairway might be picked up by a monkey and dropped deep into the rough. Or the opposite could happen. A bad hook or a slice that had produced a miserable lie might be flung right onto the middle of the fairway. So, the point of the story is that the unpredictable monkeys brought equal measures of gratuitous bad luck and good luck to the game. Now, I was charmed and fascinated when I first read this story, and the perpetual preacher in me immediately concluded this story deserved a sermon, and thus, that's the one you're getting this morning. It deserves a sermon because life is so often like this. I want to reflect on the story about this mischievous monkeys who insert themselves capriciously into the game that we humans were trying to play, for I believe it's a spiritually instructive metaphor about the lives that we have to live in this unpredictable world. I want to make several points about this story. First, there is the obvious truth of life's utter unpredictability, its frequent randomness, and if you will, its perpetual unfairness. From almost as soon as we begin to think about life as little children, I think we Homo sapiens like to think, despite the regular, abundant, and unmistakable evidence we receive to the contrary, we like to think that just as every golf course has clear rules which help us successfully finish the game, that in fact there are clear rules for the game of life that will also help us just breeze through the day. Most of us, even through adulthood, have a tape that plays at least subliminally in our heads, and that tape or life script, I think, goes something like this. If I just work hard, live right, mind my P's and Q's, obey the law, live by my principles, watch my diet, brush my teeth, exercise regularly, don't drink too much booze, tend to my marriage and career, carefully rear my children. If I follow the basic rules of life like this, I'll sail through life and everything will basically work out for me. Now this tape or narrative that plays in our heads about living by the rules is fine except for one thing. Life, as you all know, does not work this way. I can say this with certainty not only because I've been banging around this beautiful and dangerous and unpredictable creation now for over 65 years, but because for 42 years, I, as a minister, have been in the business of helping people come to terms with the random, unexpected, and sometimes profoundly unfair and painful realities that often intrude into our otherwise orderly lives. Just one heartbreaking example, if I might, from my own personal circle. I have a dear friend, his name is Drew, who was recently at the absolute top of his game. He was happily married with wonderful kids. His career was going along fabulously. He was widely respected in his community and was the picture of contentment and health when all of a sudden, seemingly out of the blue, he was diagnosed with an aggressive strain of leukemia. Now, instead of sailing effortlessly along, he was fighting for his very life and future. In just a heartbeat, everything turned on a dime, and this dear friend of mine suddenly found himself in chaos. And this can happen to any of us at any time, as you all know. Tell me if your life and world are any different, but where I live on this planet, we'll be happily playing along some gentle, broad fairway, pardon the pun, and when all of a sudden some monkey comes out of nowhere, snatches the ball, and deposits it into a difficult or painful place. This is an unpredictable universe that we live in. It is often unfair and painful, and in case you don't know it, I'm going to give you the news. You are not in control of much of what happens to you. And just as in the case of those mischievous Calcutta monkeys, and now I arrive at the second aspect of this story that rings true to me. While it is undeniably true that sometimes our ball is capriciously dropped deep in the rough, oftentimes, many other times actually, and this we must never spiritually forget, many times our ball is placed graciously right next to the pin, where all we have to do is tap it in. I passionately believe that this remarkably open and fluid world of ours, which again, we do not, despite our best and most dutiful efforts, ever succeed in really controlling, this remarkably open and fluid world of ours holds as much amazing grace and good luck as it does misfortunes and bad breaks. And I, for one, do not believe, and this is a core theological and spiritual belief of mine that informs everything I do. I do not believe that this creation of ours has any sort of master purpose or plan or intention, any more than those monkeys knew what they were doing on the golf course. I don't believe life has this real purpose or plan. Now, creation is not out to get us any more than it promises us a free ride. Creation and life on this planet is full of random and unexpected events and outcomes. And there's simply no way, despite how diligently we play by the rules we like to think are in place, there's no way we can make ourselves immune from these random occurrences. We cannot control, if we wanted to, the many pleasant events and wondrous outcomes that randomly come our way, like meeting the love of your life on a commuter train on some typical boring morning, or having all three of your kids grow up to be bright and charming and successful adults. What's the chance of that? Or through no discernible competence on your part, falling into the job you've always dreamed of, or being a lucky enough driver, as is mercifully the case with me. I've been driving since I was 16. I've never been involved in more than a fender bender. There is no simply accounting in this life for the good luck and abundant, undeserved grace that floods into our lives. And on the other, more complicated side of the equation, as I've already observed, we most certainly cannot also control many of the unpleasant events and difficult outcomes that come our way, like developing, as so many of us do at some point in our lifetimes, a life-limiting or life-threatening disease, or injuring yourself from a bad fall at home, or having a marriage fall slowly apart despite your best efforts, or losing your job due to global economic conditions, or having a son or a daughter or a grandchild get in trouble with drugs or mental illness. No matter how careful or competent or clever we are in our lives, no matter how diligently we follow the rules we think are in place, we cannot control most of the misfortunes that will come our way. And any glib, New Age guru who says, well, what is it about you that needed this misfortune in your life? Tell him to go to hell. Show him the spiritual door. Life on this planet, as I understand it anyway, is a lot like that chaos that existed on that Calcutta golf course. Weird, wild, woeful, wonderful things happen, both for good and ill. And the sooner we accept the fact, like those golfers, who wrote the new rule about playing the ball where the monkey drops it, the sooner we move ahead to finish our game with some sort of wisdom and calm and grace. The sooner we accept the randomness, the sooner we'll get there. I would pause after making this fundamental assertion about how life randomly works and make what feels to me like another crucial observation here. I think we human beings are far better at paying attention to and cataloging in our psyches all the misfortunes and unpleasantness that come our way, like some of the things that I've mentioned. We're better at cataloging the complaints than we are at taking into our hearts for safekeeping and cultivation the amazing graces and blessings that regularly come our way. Let me speak personally for a moment. I think it's pretty apparent to some of you, even though you've only met me a little while ago, that I'm a pretty cheerful and upbeat guy. In fact, I must honestly tell you that some people around me find my optimism irritating from time to time, like my spouse, when I bound out of bed at 6:21 every morning and say, honey, it's time to get going. He's not so eager about that. But my natural optimism aside, I nonetheless know that in my daily life, I am quick to notice and grumble to myself and complain to others if they will listen about any number of inconveniences or difficulties or challenges that come my way, like the toilet handle in the master bathroom that just came off the other day while I was just minding my own business, or the flat tire I had on my bike a few days ago. I was biking on A1A and I said, gee, I haven't had a flat tire for weeks. Don't ever think that, by the way, when you're on a bicycle. Or the knee pain that I have from my chronic arthritis and the artificial knee that I now have. Or the unexpected interruptions in my office that prevent me from accomplishing a crowded working plan. If those people would just leave me alone, I could get my ministry done. You know how it is? They don't seem to understand that I'm a busy guy. They knock on my door and I have to talk to them and stuff. I notice that I complain about it every time some monkey of everyday fate tosses my little ball into the rough, or a place that I think is rough anyway. And what's more, despite my best efforts to spiritually and emotionally notice and be grateful for all the good breaks and blessings that come my way, I am routinely more reluctant to acknowledge to my heart how very lucky and blessed I am. The breeze that is so often at my back, the kindnesses and courtesies that come unbidden from people in places like the Publix grocery store, the beauty of the natural world around me, a good night's sleep, which I enjoyed last night, even though it was an hour less. I'm better at noticing, I'm not as good at noticing those things as I am all my life complications. Why do I not regularly and spontaneously whistle cheerfully in my heart about all the things that go right in my life? Because there are so many of them. Why do I find that harder. I'll bet that you that anything, just like me, most of those Calcutta golfers were better at cursing the monkey when the monkey threw the ball in the rough than they were for thanking the monkeys when the ball got placed right near the pin. I'll just bet you. And my spiritual question to all of you then is, how are you doing in your lives in terms of cataloging the complaints or expressing gratitude for all the blessings that come your way? Just take a realization here for just a couple minutes. How are you doing in your daily life? Do you really focus on the good and the positive? And here is something else that is very important to remember about this duality I'm talking about difficulty, complications, grace, and blessing. Recent studies about happiness conducted by psychologists at Harvard and elsewhere, which many of you have no doubt heard about, conclude that we human beings consistently overestimate how happy or unhappy respective turns of fate will make us. In his wonderful book, Stumbling on Happiness, Dr. Daniel Gilbert, he makes those Prudential ads about retirement. You've seen him on TV? He's kind of sold out, I guess. But anyway, Dr. Gilbert writes, "What we have been seeing in my research over and over again is that people have an inability to predict what will make us happy or unhappy. Few of us can accurately gauge," he writes, "how we will feel tomorrow or next week, regardless of what happens. People," he says, "people routinely overestimate how future successes and future failures will affect their happiness, for better or worse. The truth is," he says, "bad things don't affect us as profoundly as we expect them to. And that is true of good things as well. In other words, the good isn't as good, and the bad isn't as bad as we think it's going to be." And then he goes on, "Our research simply says that whether it's some unpleasant or difficult event that occurs in our lives, both, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, both will matter less over the long term than you think they will in terms of your joy and sorrow. And the truth is that regardless of what happens, good or bad," and this is the key point here, regardless of what happens, good or bad, we human beings adapt more quickly than we think we will. Adaptability is the key word here. So Gilbert writes, "So the good news is that going blind, for example, is not going to make you as unhappy as you think it will. And the bad news is that winning the lottery is not going to make you as happy as you expect." And why is this? The answer, according to these behavioral scientists, is simple. We human beings, and now I quote them again, are generally unable to recognize that we adapt pretty well to new circumstances, be those circumstances joyful or sorrowful. We adapt more quickly than we think. And thus I arrive, to my heart at least, with the crucial spiritual and emotional point embedded with this golfing with monkeys story. And that is the supreme value of an adaptable heart. This Unitarian Universalist minister is passionately persuaded that emotional survival and spiritual success over the course of your life depends, as it did for those Calcutta golfers, on your willingness to adapt to unforeseen circumstances, both positive and negative, that will pop into your life, that you cannot, despite your best efforts, control. Just as the Calcutta golfers wrote the monkeys into the course rule book, we must write into our hearts a willingness to adapt, both to the unexpected joys and the unexpected sorrows that will burst into our lives. One little example, if I might. A few years ago, I had a little house on Chesapeake Bay when I lived in Bethesda, Maryland. And one fall day, a hurricane came up. I forget the name. Doesn't matter. And our neighbors, we were on the other side of the road from the bay. The neighbors on the bay side, they lost all their front lawns, and this was like $250,000 of gravel and everything had to be put back in with railroad ties. They were looking at a massive, massive loss of money. Their whole front lawns were swept away. The water came up 15 feet. And with my neighbor Jinx, when we got out over there the next morning, there was flotsam on the top of what used to be his lawn, and there was a gaping cavern down to the water. And I was commiserating with Jinx, and I said, Jinx, this is just terrible. My God, this is gonna just be very costly. And he said, well, yeah, the hurricane took my lawn, but it left me a beach. And sure enough, you know, there'd never been a beach down there before. And he said, there's a little beach for my grandkids, you know, to play on now. And I thought, that's exactly right. The hurricane took his lawn, but it gave him a beach. I don't know how much he felt that after the $250,000 of fill and everything else that he had put in, but I just love the optimism of that. One more quick example of human adaptability. No, I'm not going to tell that story. Let me bring this a little closer to home. For most of my adult life, I was an avid runner. Some might say an addicted runner. I would usually run 10 to 15 miles a day, a half marathon, every day, 7 days a week. Somebody said to me, why did you do that? And I said, well, because I could. It's the same reason I'm going across the country, God willing, for the 4th time. I can still do that. But in any case, there came a point where I could no longer do this beloved thing that I always had done. I couldn't run anymore. My knees, gave out. So I had to accept this profound, to me, a profound loss in my life. I used to, when I would travel to San Francisco or somewhere, I'd strap on a pair of running shoes and go out of the hotel and explore the Golden Gate Bridge, and I was so free when I ran. I could no longer do this. I had to adapt around what I would call my monkey knees. I had to adapt. I had to do something else. And of course, what I've done is I've taken up cycling. And if I can't cycle anymore, sometime I'll probably turn into a swimmer or do calisthenics. I don't know what I'll do, but the point is I had to adapt. And because I've adapted, I've fallen into love with cycling. I love cycling. It's even better than running. I'm going to see the whole country at 15, 16, 17 miles an hour. It's a wonderful thing. I've fallen in love with something that I never thought I would fall in love with, but I had to leave something that I loved, running, and I had to adapt. And because I was willing to adapt, I found a new joy. And speaking of cycling, one last example. When I lived in Washington, D.C., I took a trail called the Capitol Crescent Trail up to the River Road Church. It was 12 miles from my house. I lived down in Washington near the White House. And I'd regularly pass this guy who was about, 45, normal-looking guy on a bike. And there was only one thing different about him, the kind of bike he had. He had a bike with pedals in front of him. It was a recumbent bike, and he was pedaling this way. Because, of course, he was a paraplegic. He had no use of his legs. But he was the happiest looking guy on this grievous for most of us. And he always had a great big smile. Every time I saw him, these words of Albert Camus would come to mind. Yes, there are deprivations. There are deprivations which give rise to our worst sorrows. But what does it truly matter what we have lost when what we have lost is not yet used up? I want to repeat that phrase. What does it truly matter what we have lost when what we have lost is not yet truly used up? In a similar vein, Rabbi Harold Schlieweiss tells about handicapped violinist Yitzhak Perlman in this story poem. This is about a concert that they witnessed in New York City, he and his wife. He writes, "We have seen Yitzhak Perlman, who walks the stage with braces on both legs, on 2 crutches. He takes his seat, unhinges the clasp on his leg, tucking one leg back, extending the other, laying down his crutches, placing the violin under his chin. On one occasion, one of his violin strings broke. The audience grew silent, but the violinist did not leave the stage. He signaled the maestro, and the orchestra began its part. The violinist played with power and intensity on only 3 strings. With 3 strings, he modulated and changed and recomposed the piece in his head. He retuned the strings to get different sounds, tuned them upward and downward. The audience screamed delight, applauded their appreciation. Asked later how he had accomplished this feat, the violinist answered thus: "It is my task to make music with what remains." A legacy mightier than a concert, this. Make music with what remains. Complete the song left for us to sing. Transcend the loss. Play it out with heart and soul and might, with all remaining strength within us. Some of you may be aware that several recent psychological studies talk about what makes for successful aging. And every one of those studies indicates that it is the adapters, those who are willing to adapt to new information about their lives. As you know, Judith Fiores talks about necessary losses. As the necessary losses accumulate in our lives, it is the adapters. It is the adapters, the people who will write a new rule into their heart about the way life is going to work for them. They're the ones who survive with happiness. All right. I've been at this for almost 30 minutes, and it's time for me to wrap this up. Way back in seminary, we were told in preaching class, and I've taught this too at Andover, Newton, and elsewhere, that in a sermon you have to do 3 things. You have to tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. And now we've arrived at the 3rd crucial stage. I'm going to tell you what I told you. So listen up real quick. Life is often hard. It's difficult, it's unpredictable, it's chaotic, and it's often unfair. Random things happen to us, they will happen to us, they will throw us for a loop, wreak havoc in our orderly lives, and render inoperative all those sure and secure rules by which we think we can control things. In a creation as open and fluid as ours, we cannot control such random and difficult circumstance. But we are radically in charge of our inner lives. We can control how we react and how we proceed. We can realign the cambers of our heart to allow us to creatively and bravely adapt to whatever new information we're receiving about what life is going to be for us. Like the golfers in Calcutta, we are free to stay in the game and be a player. We can play the ball where the monkey drops it. Now, some of you tomorrow may go into a library, or maybe you had a husband who stayed home today, and they'll say, "What did you learn in church yesterday?" And I want you to practice this now. What you learned is to play the ball where? Ah, honey, what did you learn in church today? I learned to adapt. You seem to have it. My work is done. Amen. And we have a hymn, don't we? Markova. I will not live an unlived life. I will not live in fear of falling or catching fire. I choose to inhabit my days, to allow my living to open me, to make me less afraid, more accessible, to loosen my heart until it becomes a wing, a torch,